A quiet army base in Hawaii hides a chilling secret. A devoted wife murdered in her sleep, a soldier husband playing the grieving spouse, and a lover drawn into a deadly pact. Behind military discipline and island calm, desire and deception ignite a plot that ends in cold-blooded betrayal. The summer of 2014 settled warm and heavy over the island of Oahu, casting its familiar glow across the orderly streets of Schofield Barracks. Among the thousands of soldiers and families living behind the gates of this sprawling U.S. Army base, Catherine Walker appeared to embody the quiet strength expected of a military wife. At 38, she was devoted to her husband, Army medic Michael Walker, and to the routines of base life, supporting his demanding schedule, maintaining their modest on-base housing, and keeping a warm home for friends and neighbors who often dropped by. To those who knew them casually, Michael and Catherine seemed steady and dependable, a couple shaped by the discipline of service and the shared sacrifices of military duty. No one could have imagined that behind the neat curtains of their duplex, a deadly betrayal was already taking root. Michael Walker, a respected specialist with years of service, wore the polished veneer of a model soldier. Colleagues described him as competent and calm, a man who knew how to follow orders and carry responsibility. But beneath the uniform, his personal life was unraveling. He had grown restless in his marriage, drawn toward the thrill of secret relationships and the validation of online encounters. Late at night, while Catherine slept, Michael scrolled through dating sites and social forums, searching for connection beyond the boundaries of his vows. It was during one of those late sessions that he met Elsa Lisa Jackson, a 25-year-old civilian who lived miles away but seemed, through the glow of a phone screen, irresistibly close. Their first exchanges were playful and impulsive, the kind of flirtation Michael had indulged before. But Jackson offered something different. Lonely and emotionally vulnerable, she responded to his attention with an intensity that fed his ego and dulled his guilt. Within weeks, the messages between them deepened into confessions of desire and plans to meet in person. Jackson revealed struggles with mental health, including episodes of paranoia and delusions when she was off her medication. Rather than recoil, Michael saw opportunity. He presented himself as a rescuer, a man who understood her loneliness, even as he cultivated a fantasy of escape from the life he shared with Catherine. By the late summer, their clandestine relationship had moved beyond flirtation. They met secretly, exchanging photographs and intimate promises, using coded language to hide their growing obsession. Michael complained of his marriage, portraying Catherine as an obstacle to happiness, while Jackson clung to the belief that their love was destined. The affair might have remained a reckless secret, but the conversations began to darken. Michael spoke of the impossibility of divorce, of financial entanglements and military benefits that made separation difficult. He hinted at a life together unencumbered by Catherine's presence, sketching a future in which he and Jackson could be free. Jackson, eager to please and desperate for connection, absorbed every word. Inside the Walker home, Catherine sensed little of the danger gathering around her. Friends later recalled that she remained cheerful and trusting, unaware of the late-night texts and hidden meetings that consumed her husband's attention. Her days followed the quiet rhythms of base life. Morning errands, calls to family back on the mainland, evenings spent waiting for Michael's shifts to end. On the night of November 14th, those familiar patterns would be shattered forever. It began with a series of deliberate choices. Michael scheduled himself for an overnight shift at Tripler Army Medical Center, ensuring he would be away from the house and surrounded by colleagues who could later confirm his whereabouts. Before leaving, he exchanged messages with Jackson, reviewing the details of the plan they had nurtured through weeks of secret communication. He described the layout of the home, the location of a spare key hidden near the back door, and the quiet habits of his sleeping wife. There would be no forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the violence itself. He instructed Jackson to use a simple code: good, if she could enter through an unlocked window; bad, if she needed the key. It was the kind of cold precision that investigators would later find chilling. As Michael drove to his shift, Jackson prepared for the night's grim task. Carrying only a small bag, she approached the Walker residence under the cover of darkness, the humid Hawaiian air heavy around her. A message from Michael confirmed the status. Bad. The doors were locked, the window secured. She retrieved the key and slipped silently inside. The house smelled faintly of detergent and cooked meals, the ordinary scent of domestic life that made the mission all the more surreal. Moving carefully through the quiet rooms, she selected a knife from the kitchen, its familiar weight both terrifying and necessary. Upstairs, Catherine slept, unaware of the intruder standing at the threshold of her bedroom. Jackson hesitated only briefly before crossing the final distance. In a sudden burst of violence, she stabbed Catherine repeatedly, targeting the neck and torso with frenzied precision. Catherine awoke in confusion and terror, but the attack was swift. Jackson later admitted she waited nearly half an hour to ensure her victim no longer breathed, lingering in the stillness of a room that moments earlier had been a sanctuary. Then, as quietly as she had entered, she left, carrying the knife with her and leaving behind a scene of intimate horror. While Jackson melted back into the night, Michael maintained the facade of routine. He remained at the hospital, greeting co-workers, logging his rounds, and sending the occasional text to his mistress. His alibi was intact. Hours later, he returned home and dialed 911, his voice trembling as he reported the grisly discovery of his wife's body. Responding officers found him distraught, pacing near the doorway of the blood-streaked bedroom. The crime scene told a story of calculated intimacy. No forced entry, no theft, only the brutal evidence of a targeted killing. Military police secured the home as Honolulu detectives joined the investigation. From the outset, the circumstances raised suspicion. The absence of defensive wounds suggested Catherine had been attacked in her sleep. The lack of forced entry pointed toward someone with knowledge of the house. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no break-ins, no sounds of struggle. Detectives began the painstaking process of collecting fingerprints, swabbing for DNA, and examining digital devices. Michael, the grieving husband, cooperated fully, offering statements and granting access to his phone. His performance of shock and sorrow impressed some investigators, but inconsistencies soon emerged. The timeline of his movements, the peculiar details of his late-night walk, and the calm precision of his statements hinted at a deeper involvement. As the first week of the investigation unfolded, small clues began to pierce the surface of Michael's carefully constructed narrative. Forensic technicians found no evidence of an external intruder. Surveillance cameras around the base showed Jackson's vehicle entering the area on the night of the murder. Digital analysts recovered fragments of deleted messages between Michael and an unidentified woman. Each discovery tightened the circle, transforming a seemingly random act of violence into a case of calculated betrayal. Within the secure walls of Schofield Barracks, a story of love, obsession, and murder was beginning to reveal itself, and the man who claimed to be a grieving husband was moving steadily from witness to suspect. In the days following Catherine Walker's murder, the investigation intensified as military police and Honolulu detectives worked side by side, driven by the unsettling realization that the killer was likely someone Catherine knew. The lack of forced entry, the choice of a kitchen knife from within the home, and the precise timing of the attack left little room for the theory of a random intruder. Detectives focused on Michael Walker, who continued to present himself as the devastated husband. He attended briefings with investigators, offered to answer questions at any hour, and carefully recounted his activities on the night of the killing. To the casual observer, he was a man overwhelmed by loss. To seasoned investigators, however, his composure seemed studied, his grief rehearsed. Detectives began examining the couple's digital lives, searching for hidden communications and unexplained contacts. Michael willingly turned over his phone, confident that his late-night messages had been deleted and his browsing history carefully erased. What he underestimated was the persistence of forensic technology. Specialists soon retrieved fragments of conversations that hinted at a secret relationship. Certain phone numbers appeared repeatedly, linked to text exchanges that stretched late into the night. One of those numbers belonged to Elsa Lisa Jackson, a name unknown to Catherine's friends and family but destined to become central to the case. The first interviews with Jackson were cautious and brief. Detectives located her through cell phone records and social media profiles, noting that she had no direct connection to the Walkers outside of Michael. When questioned, she appeared nervous and evasive, insisting that she barely knew Michael and had no involvement in the crime. Her story was inconsistent, and investigators quickly noticed gaps in her timeline for the night of the murder. Surveillance footage from base checkpoints placed her vehicle near Schofield Barracks around the estimated time of Catherine's death, contradicting her initial claims. The pressure mounted as detectives confronted her with evidence of phone calls and text messages exchanged with Michael in the hours leading up to the attack. While Jackson struggled to maintain her denial, forensic analysts uncovered the most damning proof: a series of text messages between her and Michael that read like a coded script for murder. In these exchanges, Michael detailed the layout of the house, Catherine's habits, and the locations of spare keys. He instructed Jackson on how to enter undetected, using words like good and bad to indicate the status of doors and windows. One message, sent shortly before the killing, contained the single word bad, signaling that Jackson should use the hidden key. The chilling precision of these instructions left no doubt that the murder was premeditated and that Michael was not merely a grieving spouse but an active participant in planning his wife's death. Investigators confronted Michael with the digital evidence, but he maintained a facade of innocence. He insisted the messages were misunderstood, claiming they related to harmless personal matters. His calm explanations began to fray when detectives revealed that Jackson had been seen near the crime scene. Behind closed doors, they pressed him with questions about his relationship with her. Michael admitted to an affair but denied any involvement in violence, portraying himself as a victim of Jackson's obsession. He claimed she had acted alone, driven by jealousy and mental instability, a narrative that attempted to distance himself from the murder while acknowledging the affair that bound them. The breakthrough came when Jackson, facing overwhelming evidence and the threat of a life sentence, agreed to a second interview. This time she arrived with a public defender and a different demeanor. She admitted to killing Catherine but described Michael as the architect of the plan. In a trembling voice, she recounted how he had nurtured their relationship with promises of a future together, weaving fantasies of marriage and shared happiness if Catherine were no longer in the way. Jackson explained how Michael convinced her that eliminating Catherine was the only path to their imagined life. He provided details about the home, reassured her about his alibi, and encouraged her to carry out the attack while he worked a night shift to avoid suspicion. Her confession filled in the gaps that investigators had painstakingly assembled. She described arriving at the Walker residence, receiving the bad text, retrieving the hidden key, and selecting a knife from the kitchen before climbing the stairs to the master bedroom. She recalled the moment she stood over Catherine's sleeping form, the surge of fear and adrenaline, and the repeated stabs that ended Catherine's life. Jackson admitted that Michael instructed her to remain in the room after the attack to ensure Catherine was dead, a detail that aligned with forensic estimates of the time between the assault and the discovery of the body. With Jackson's statement, prosecutors built a compelling narrative of conspiracy and murder. They argued that Michael Walker exploited Jackson's vulnerability, manipulating her emotions to achieve his goal of removing his wife. Financial records strengthened the case. Michael had recently reviewed Catherine's life insurance policies, which totaled nearly $400,000. He had complained to Jackson about the difficulties of divorce within the military system and the loss of benefits that separation would bring. The promise of insurance money and a life free of marital obligations became central to the prosecution's theory of motive. The military community reacted with disbelief and outrage as the details emerged. Friends who once saw Michael as a devoted husband now viewed him as a calculating predator who had weaponized an unstable lover. Catherine's family, devastated by the revelations, attended each hearing with quiet determination, listening as prosecutors described the betrayal that led to her death. They learned of the secret meetings, the coded messages, and the cold planning that transformed a marriage into a murder plot. Michael was arrested in early 2015, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The Army placed him in custody as civilian and military jurisdictions coordinated the prosecution. Jackson, having confessed and agreed to testify, faced her own charges but secured a plea agreement in exchange for her cooperation. Her testimony promised to expose the inner workings of their deadly relationship, providing jurors with an unfiltered account of how passion and manipulation combined to create a lethal conspiracy. As pretrial hearings unfolded, Michael's defense team attempted to portray Jackson as the sole instigator, a troubled woman who misinterpreted his words and acted on her own. They emphasized her history of mental illness and argued that she fabricated the conspiracy to reduce her sentence. Prosecutors countered with a mountain of evidence: text messages retrieved from both phones, surveillance footage, phone tower data placing Jackson near the crime scene, and forensic analysis linking the kitchen knife to the Walker's home. Each piece reinforced the central truth that Michael had orchestrated the murder with chilling precision. In the courtroom, the contrast between the defendants was striking. Jackson appeared fragile and subdued, her voice halting as she recounted the affair and the night of the killing. Michael sat upright in his uniform during initial hearings, projecting an air of controlled confidence that barely concealed the gravity of the accusations. Observers noted his lack of visible emotion when graphic photographs and forensic details were presented. To the prosecution, this stoicism was evidence of his calculated nature. To the defense, it was the composure of an innocent man unjustly accused. As the trial approached, anticipation grew within the military community and the broader public. The case was no longer just a story of marital betrayal but a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy and manipulation within a tightly regulated world. Behind the crisp uniforms and structured lives of military families, investigators had uncovered a reality of hidden desires and deadly plans. The once-admired Army medic now faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, and the woman who carried out the brutal act prepared to recount every word and action that had bound them together in murder. The trial of Michael Walker unfolded in a federal courtroom that seemed to shrink under the weight of betrayal and calculated violence. Reporters filled the gallery, military families sat shoulder to shoulder with civilians, and Catherine Walker's relatives occupied the front rows, their grief sharpened by months of revelations. The prosecution opened with a stark portrayal of Michael as a man who hid behind the discipline of his uniform while plotting his wife's death. They outlined the affair, the insurance policies, and the coded messages that mapped a path to murder. Each exhibit was presented with deliberate precision: the text transcripts, the surveillance footage of Ailsa Jackson's car approaching Schofield Barracks, the forensic analysis of the knife taken from the Walker's own kitchen. Every detail underscored a plan too meticulous to be spontaneous. Witness after witness chipped away at the image of a loyal soldier. Digital forensic experts described recovering deleted texts that revealed an escalating fantasy of life without Catherine. Military colleagues testified about Michael's carefully scheduled night shift, which provided the alibi he thought would protect him. Friends of Catherine recalled her devotion to her husband and the absence of any warning that her marriage was in danger. The cumulative effect was devastating, painting a portrait of a man who valued personal freedom and financial gain over the life of the woman who trusted him. The most gripping testimony came from Ailsa Jackson herself. Dressed in a plain suit, she entered the courtroom with her head lowered, her voice trembling as she began to recount the affair that spiraled into murder. She described meeting Michael online, the intoxicating rush of secret messages, and the gradual transformation of flirtation into conspiracy. Her words traced the evolution of a deadly partnership. The conversations about Catherine's routines, the discussions of keys and windows, the agreement that Michael would create an alibi while she carried out the attack. She admitted to wielding the knife but insisted that Michael's manipulation guided her every step. At times she wept, recalling the night she crept into the bedroom and the quiet moment after Catherine's final breath when she lingered to ensure the deed was complete. The courtroom sat silent as she described leaving the house, receiving Michael's reassuring texts, and waiting for news of the discovery. The defense sought to dismantle Jackson's credibility, highlighting her history of mental illness and suggesting she acted out of jealousy and delusion. They argued that Michael's messages were taken out of context, that his complaints about marriage were not instructions for murder. They questioned her motives for testifying, pointing to the plea agreement that spared her a life sentence. Yet each cross-examination only reinforced the consistency of her account and the corroborating digital evidence. When prosecutors displayed the final text exchange, Michael's single-word message "bad," signaling the use of the hidden key, the jury watched Michael's face for any flicker of emotion. He remained expressionless, a soldier maintaining discipline even as the walls closed in. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. They returned with a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Catherine's family clasped hands as the words were read, their quiet tears reflecting both relief and the enduring pain of loss. Michael sat rigid, his gaze fixed forward, betraying no outward reaction. The judge, noting the calculated nature of the crime and the betrayal of marital trust, sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that the former Army medic who once saved lives would spend the remainder of his own behind bars. Elsa Jackson, already convicted under a plea deal, received a lengthy sentence of 30 years. During her sentencing hearing, she addressed Catherine's family directly, her voice breaking as she apologized for the pain she caused. Catherine's relatives listened with a dignity that impressed even hardened court officials. Catherine's father spoke of forgiveness, saying that while justice required punishment, his daughter's memory demanded compassion. His words offered a rare moment of grace in a case defined by cruelty and deception. The aftermath of the trial rippled through the military community. Schofield Barracks, normally a place of regimented order, became a cautionary symbol of the hidden chaos that can exist within seemingly stable lives. Fellow soldiers who once admired Michael struggled to reconcile the medic they knew with the cold strategist revealed in court. Military leaders used the case to underscore the importance of mental health resources, the dangers of unchecked personal relationships, and the need for vigilance even within secure communities. For Catherine's friends and family, the verdict provided closure but not comfort. They remembered her as a woman of quiet strength, devoted to her family and supportive of the military life she shared with her husband. In memorial services and private gatherings, they celebrated her generosity and gentle spirit, choosing to focus on the love she gave rather than the violence that ended her life. Photographs of Catherine smiling in sunlit Hawaiian landscapes circulated among mourners, a reminder of the vibrant life extinguished by greed and obsession. As years passed, the Walker-Jackson case remained a subject of true crime documentaries and military training seminars. Analysts pointed to the psychological dynamics that allowed Michael to manipulate Jackson. His calculated use of her mental instability, his exploitation of her desire for affection, and his willingness to trade human life for personal gain. Legal scholars examined the coordination between civilian and military jurisdictions, noting how digital evidence became the linchpin of the prosecution's strategy. Each retelling reinforced the lesson that behind the strict codes of duty and honor, human frailty can fester unseen. Inside prison walls, Michael maintained his innocence to some correspondents, claiming that he never intended harm and that Jackson acted on her own. But letters intercepted by investigators revealed flashes of the same manipulative charm he once used to lure her into his orbit. Jackson, serving her sentence in a separate facility, participated in mental health treatment programs and occasionally expressed remorse in interviews, acknowledging that she allowed fantasy to override morality. Both remained bound by the choices that linked them on the night of November 14, 2014, a night when desire, greed, and betrayal converged in a deadly conspiracy. The story of Catherine Walker's murder endures not only because of its shocking betrayal. On a quiet August morning in Maryland, a young soldier was found shot to death beside her unharmed baby, a crime scene as precise as it was chilling. Behind the locked doors of military life, jealousy and control ignited a cross-country murder plot that stunned investigators and shattered a family. The night of August 25, 2015, settled quietly over the suburban streets of Severn, Maryland, a modest community bordering the heavily guarded gates of Fort Meade. It was the kind of neighborhood where late summer evenings passed without incident, where the faint hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog marked the passing hours. Inside a brick townhouse on Pullington Way, 24-year-old Army Private First Class Carlin Ramirez was ending a long day of balancing the duties of motherhood and military life. Only 4 months earlier she had given birth to a baby girl, a child she now raised on her own after separating from her husband, Army Sergeant Malik Kearney. Friends described her as fiercely independent, a young woman determined to carve out a future that belonged solely to her and her daughter. She had her routines, her quiet rituals, and a commitment to keep moving forward despite the turbulence of a recent breakup that had left her wary of the man she once trusted. When a neighbor noticed the front door of the townhouse ajar the following morning, curiosity turned quickly to alarm. The resident called authorities, concerned that something was wrong, and Arundel County police officers arrived to find a scene that would unsettle even the most seasoned investigator. Inside the dimly lit home, Carlin lay lifeless on the floor, shot 3 times at close range. Next to her, miraculously unharmed, her infant daughter rested in a car seat, awake but silent. The meticulous arrangement of the scene was striking. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, and no evidence of theft. The door showed no damage, suggesting that the killer either possessed a key or had been willingly allowed inside. Even the baby's careful placement near her mother hinted at an unnerving mixture of calculation and cold resolve. Detectives quickly realized this was not a random act of violence. The absence of struggle and the precision of the attack suggested a personal motive, perhaps someone who knew Carlin's habits and movements. Investigators from both the and Arundel County Police Department and the Army's Criminal Investigation Division joined forces, aware that the victim's military status might open leads beyond the local community. They began the painstaking process of mapping Carlin's final hours, collecting surveillance footage, interviewing neighbors, and securing every trace of forensic evidence. Shell casings from a .40 caliber handgun provided the first tangible clue, but it was the lack of forced entry that drove early suspicions toward someone familiar. As detectives delved into Carlin's personal life, a troubling narrative emerged. Only months earlier she had separated from Sergeant Malik Kearney, a fellow soldier stationed thousands of miles away at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington state. Their relationship, once a typical military romance filled with shared ambitions, had deteriorated into a pattern of control and intimidation. Friends recalled Carlin confiding about Kearney's temper, his jealousy, and his need to dictate her choices. Court records confirmed she had sought a protective order, evidence of her fear and a desire to create distance. Those close to her said she was determined to build a safe environment for her daughter, refusing reconciliation despite Kearney's attempts to maintain contact. With this background, investigators turned their attention toward Kearney. At first glance, his alibi appeared unshakable. He was officially on duty in Washington, more than 2,700 miles from Maryland, when the murder occurred. Yet military records showed a brief, unexplained absence coinciding with the night of the killing. Travel logs revealed that he had requested leave around the same time but had not provided clear details of his whereabouts. Detectives began piecing together a cross-country timeline that hinted at careful planning. Surveillance cameras along airports, rental car counters, and highways gradually filled in the gaps, painting a picture of a soldier who had left his post under the cover of routine military movements. The deeper investigators probed, the more they uncovered a web of logistics pointing back to Kearney. Phone records placed him in contact with a woman named Dolores Delgado, his girlfriend in San Antonio, Texas. Delgado's name surfaced repeatedly in financial transactions and travel arrangements that coincided with Kearney's unaccounted movements. Detectives suspected she had played a supporting role, whether knowingly or under manipulation. Her connection to Kearney introduced the possibility of a conspiracy, a jealous ex-husband unwilling to relinquish control, aided by a partner eager to prove loyalty. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked tirelessly to secure the physical evidence from the crime scene. Ballistics experts examined the shell casings and bullet trajectories, confirming the use of a .40 caliber handgun fired at close range. The precision of the shots suggested familiarity with firearms, a skill Kearney possessed as an experienced soldier. Digital forensics specialists scoured Carlin's phone and computer, uncovering messages that chronicled her growing fear of her estranged husband. In one exchange, she expressed worry about being followed and mentioned plans to change her living arrangements to protect her child. As these threads tightened, the emotional weight of the case grew heavier. Colleagues at Fort Meade described Carlin as a disciplined, upbeat soldier who rarely complained, even under the strain of new motherhood. Her decision to separate from Kearney had been difficult but necessary, a step toward independence and safety. Those closest to her remembered her resolve to provide a stable life for her daughter, a determination that now stood in haunting contrast to the violence that ended her life. Investigators began reconstructing Kearney's possible route from Washington state to Maryland and back again. Rental car receipts indicated he had obtained a vehicle in the days before the murder. GPS data from a borrowed car, along with toll records along Interstate 95, placed him on a path consistent with a covert cross-country drive. Airline logs revealed no commercial flights under his name, reinforcing the theory that he had chosen ground travel to avoid detection. Each piece of evidence, while circumstantial on its own, collectively outlined a journey of premeditation, a soldier leveraging his training to mask a deadly mission. Attention soon focused on Dolores Delgado as the potential key to unlocking the case. Detectives interviewed her repeatedly, pressing for details about her relationship with Kearney and any knowledge of his movements. At first, she maintained a cautious silence, claiming ignorance of his plans. But as evidence mounted, phone records, text messages, and surveillance images showing her lending her car, her resolve began to crack. Under the weight of mounting proof, she eventually admitted that Kearney had borrowed her vehicle and a handgun, both of which matched critical elements of the crime scene. Her statements provided investigators with the missing links needed to transform suspicion into a prosecutable case. By late 2015, authorities had assembled a chilling portrait of calculated violence. Kearney, unable to accept the end of his marriage and threatened by Carlin's independence, had orchestrated a cross-country trip to eliminate her. Delgado, motivated by devotion or fear, supplied the means, a vehicle, a weapon, and the fragile cover story he needed. The baby's survival, though miraculous, underscored the deliberate nature of the act. This was not a chaotic crime of passion, but a mission executed with military precision, leaving investigators both impressed by the meticulous planning and horrified by the coldness behind it. The first phase of the investigation closed with federal agents and county detectives confident they had identified their suspect. Yet the challenge ahead was formidable. They needed to transform a network of circumstantial evidence into a case strong enough to withstand courtroom scrutiny. With Kearney back on duty in Washington and carefully maintaining his composure, investigators prepared for the next stage, a high-stakes pursuit of justice that would test their resolve and reveal the darker truths hidden beneath the disciplined exterior of military life. As investigators tightened their net around Sergeant Malik Kearney, the case shifted from discovery to pursuit. Detectives from Anne Arundel County coordinated with Army Criminal Investigation Division agents and federal prosecutors to gather every scrap of proof that would hold up under legal scrutiny. They knew the pieces fit together, but each link required verification strong enough to withstand the inevitable challenges of a defense team. Flight records, rental car contracts, toll transponder data, and cell tower pings were cross-referenced against military duty logs. Slowly, the broad outline of a clandestine cross-country journey sharpened into a minute-by-minute timeline. Kearney's leave request from Joint Base Lewis McChord had seemed routine, yet timestamps on digital keycards and surveillance cameras exposed a carefully planned absence. He had left Washington state in the dead of night, traveled thousands of miles to Maryland, and returned to his post before anyone questioned his whereabouts. The breakthrough came when investigators persuaded Dolores Delgado to cooperate. At first she resisted, fearful of implicating herself, but the pressure of mounting evidence forced a reckoning. Interrogators methodically presented her with text messages, call logs, and bank transactions that painted a damning picture. Confronted with proof she could no longer deny, Delgado admitted that Kearney had borrowed her car and her .40 caliber handgun shortly before the murder. She recounted how he arrived in San Antonio unexpectedly, calm but determined, and asked for her help under the guise of a vague personal mission. He promised he would return soon and urged her not to ask questions. In her statements, she described a relationship marked by manipulation, where Kearney's charm alternated with quiet threats of abandonment. Her confession confirmed investigators' theory that the murder weapon had been supplied by someone close to Kearney, and that his journey from Washington to Maryland was not a frantic impulse but a calculated expedition. Armed with Delgado's testimony, federal agents began retracing Kearney's path in exacting detail. Surveillance footage from gas stations along Interstate 95 showed a man matching his description refueling a vehicle registered to Delgado. GPS data extracted from the car's onboard system revealed precise stops at rest areas and motels along the route, aligning perfectly with the estimated time of Carlin Ramirez's death. Digital forensic specialists uncovered deleted text messages, in which Kearney reassured Delgado of his return and hinted cryptically at finishing what needed to be done. Ballistic analysis completed the chain, matching shell casings from the crime scene to the handgun Delgado eventually surrendered to authorities after Kearney instructed her to dispose of it. Investigators recovered the weapon in a remote field outside San Antonio, where Delgado admitted she had hidden it under his direction. While evidence mounted, prosecutors worked quietly to secure a federal indictment. Because Kearney had crossed state lines to commit the crime, the case qualified as interstate domestic violence resulting in murder, a charge carrying the possibility of life imprisonment. Federal jurisdiction allowed investigators to sidestep potential complications of military versus civilian prosecution and ensured the full resources of the Justice Department could be brought to bear. Agents coordinated surveillance on Kearney as he continued his duties at Joint Base Lewis McChord, documenting his movements and conversations while keeping the investigation confidential. The soldier maintained an outward appearance of discipline and routine, unaware of the growing case building silently around him. In January 2017, nearly 18 months after Carlin's murder, federal marshals moved in. Kearney was arrested during a morning operation designed to minimize risk and prevent escape. News of the arrest spread quickly through military channels, sending shockwaves across Fort Meade and Joint Base Lewis McChord. Fellow soldiers who had once respected his professionalism now faced the unsettling realization that one of their own stood accused of killing a fellow service member. At the same time, Dolores Delgado was charged with conspiracy and related firearm offenses, her cooperation earning her a recommendation for leniency but not immunity. The arrests marked a decisive moment in a case that had demanded patience and meticulous preparation. As pretrial hearings began, prosecutors laid out the chilling narrative they intended to present to a jury. They argued that Kearney's motive stemmed from jealousy and control. Carlin Ramirez, determined to end an abusive relationship, had filed for a protective order and made clear her intention to raise her daughter without Kearney's involvement. For a man accustomed to authority and obedience, the rejection was intolerable. Investigators described how Kearney exploited his military training to plan an operation with precision, borrowing an unregistered vehicle, avoiding commercial flights, and using a personal connection to obtain a firearm. Delgado's testimony would place him in Maryland on the night of the murder, while forensic evidence tied him to the weapon and the crime scene. Defense attorneys sought to undermine the timeline, suggesting that circumstantial evidence could not definitively place Kearney at the townhouse when the shots were fired. They questioned Delgado's credibility, portraying her as a scorned lover seeking to protect herself by shifting blame. They highlighted the absence of direct eyewitnesses and argued that travel records could be misinterpreted. But the government's case rested on a web of mutually reinforcing evidence. Cell tower data, vehicle GPS logs, toll records, and surveillance images formed a chain too strong to dismiss. Each detail, Delgado's car crossing state lines, Kearney's sudden absence from base, the recovered handgun, corroborated the others. The emotional weight of the proceedings was profound. Carlin's family attended every session, quietly enduring the graphic recounting of her final moments. Fellow soldiers testified about her character, describing a young mother dedicated to her child and her service. Prosecutors introduced the protective order she had filed, a document that gave jurors a glimpse of her fear and determination to break free. Experts explained how domestic violence often escalates when the victim attempts to leave, reinforcing the argument that Kearney's actions fit a deadly pattern of control turned lethal. The presence of Carlin's infant daughter in the home on the night of the murder underscored the calculated cruelty of the act, a fact prosecutors repeated with quiet emphasis. Delgado's testimony became the linchpin of the trial. Taking the stand under the weight of her own charges, she recounted the events leading up to the murder with a mixture of regret and resolve. She described how Kearney confided vague plans for a trip, how he requested her car and weapon, and how he returned days later with a calm demeanor that belied the violence he had committed. Her account of disposing of the handgun, later recovered through her cooperation, provided jurors with the direct connection between Kearney and the murder weapon. Defense attorneys attempted to paint her as unreliable, but her story remained consistent and was supported by the physical evidence investigators had painstakingly gathered. Outside the courtroom, the case drew attention from both civilian and military communities. Advocates for domestic violence victims pointed to Carlin's death as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by service members seeking to escape abusive relationships. Military officials acknowledged the need for stronger safeguards and better support systems for soldiers in crisis. Reporters covering the trial highlighted the contrast between the disciplined world of military service and the private turmoil that had culminated in a calculated killing. The narrative resonated far beyond Maryland, illustrating how personal violence can infiltrate even the most structured environments. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the government's argument remained steady and relentless. They presented Kearney as a man unwilling to accept the loss of control, a soldier who transformed his tactical training into a plan for murder. They described a journey measured in miles and moments, from the moment he left Washington to the silent return after the crime. The defense continued to probe for inconsistencies, but the mosaic of evidence left little room for doubt. Jurors listened intently as prosecutors recounted the final hours of Carlin Ramirez, a narrative of independence met with fatal obsession. By the time closing arguments approached, the courtroom atmosphere was taut with expectation. Prosecutors urged the jury to consider the totality of the evidence: the digital trail, the recovered weapon, the testimony of a partner turned accomplice. They emphasized that each detail, no matter how small, fit into a coherent story of premeditation and execution. Defense counsel asked jurors to resist emotional appeals and focus on the lack of a direct eyewitness, but the cumulative weight of the case was undeniable. When the jury retired to deliberate, observers sensed that the long pursuit of justice for Carlin Ramirez was nearing its end. The jury deliberated for hours inside the federal courthouse in Greenbelt, Maryland, sifting through weeks of testimony and hundreds of exhibits that mapped a journey of jealousy and precision. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict carried the weight of a long and painstaking investigation. Malik Kearney was found guilty of interstate domestic violence resulting in murder, along with related firearm offenses. The decision came without hesitation, a unanimous acknowledgement of the trail of evidence that stretched from a quiet townhouse in Severn to the highways that spanned the continent. Kearney, dressed in a crisp suit and flanked by defense counsel, remained expressionless as the verdict was read. Observers noted the same controlled demeanor that had marked his military service, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the realization that his carefully planned crime had failed to escape the reach of justice. The sentencing phase brought raw emotion to the surface. Prosecutors outlined the deliberate nature of the killing, describing how Kearney had left his post under false pretenses, traveled thousands of miles, and executed a mother while her infant daughter lay only feet away. They emphasized that this was not a moment of passion but a calculated act meant to eliminate a woman who sought freedom from his control. Family members of Carlin Ramirez addressed the court, speaking of her dedication to service, her joy as a mother, and the enduring pain of her absence. They described birthdays missed, a child growing up without a mother, and the fear Carlin had voiced in the days before her death. Their statements underscored the human cost behind the meticulous evidence, transforming data and timelines into a story of stolen life and irreparable loss. Defense attorneys argued for leniency, portraying Kearney as a decorated soldier whose actions were out of character, a man who might one day seek redemption. They pointed to his previously clean record and military service, suggesting the pressures of separation and fatherhood had clouded his judgment. But the prosecution countered with the cold facts of preparation: the borrowed car, the hidden weapon, the cross-country drive executed with military discipline. Federal guidelines left little room for mitigation. The judge delivered a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, declaring that the calculated nature of the crime demanded the harshest penalty allowed by law. The ruling ensured that Kearney would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a soldier stripped of rank and freedom. Dolores Delgado faced her own reckoning, Her cooperation had been instrumental in securing Kearney's conviction, but it did not absolve her of responsibility. Prosecutors acknowledged her assistance but detailed her role in providing the car and weapon, as well as her attempt to hide the firearm after the murder. In a separate proceeding, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy and related firearm charges. The judge weighed her cooperation and imposed a reduced sentence of 17 years in federal prison. Delgado wept as she apologized to Carlin's family, admitting that her loyalty to Kearney blinded her to the deadly consequences of her actions. Her punishment served as both accountability and a cautionary tale of how devotion can be twisted into complicity. For Carlin's family, the verdicts brought a measure of closure but not relief. They left the courthouse knowing that justice had been served but acutely aware that no sentence could restore the young soldier whose life had been defined by resilience and quiet strength. Friends and fellow soldiers from Fort Meade gathered to honor her memory, sharing stories of her kindness, her ambition, and the pride she took in both motherhood and military service. Memorial ceremonies on base highlighted her dedication to duty, while advocacy groups invoked her name in campaigns to strengthen protections for victims of domestic violence within the armed forces. Carlin's death became a rallying point for reform, a reminder that the strict hierarchy of military life cannot shield service members from intimate danger. The aftermath of the trial rippled through military and civilian circles alike. Analysts examined the warning signs that preceded the murder, the protective order Carlin sought, the documented incidents of control and jealousy, the subtle but escalating threats. Domestic violence experts noted that the most dangerous time for a victim is often after leaving an abusive relationship, when the abuser senses a loss of control. Carlin's case fit this pattern with chilling precision, underscoring the need for intervention strategies and rapid response when service members report threats from intimate partners. Army officials responded with renewed emphasis on support programs and reporting mechanisms, acknowledging that the culture of discipline and chain of command can sometimes discourage victims from seeking help. Inside the walls of federal prison, Kearney began a life defined by confinement, stripped of the authority and mobility that once defined his identity. Fellow inmates knew him only as a convicted murderer, not as the disciplined sergeant he once projected. Delgado began her own sentence, separated from the man who had drawn her into a crime that shattered multiple lives. Their futures, once intertwined by secrecy and manipulation, diverged into parallel punishments that mirrored the cold finality of their actions. Neither would see freedom for decades, if ever. Carlin's daughter, the silent witness to that night of violence, grew under the care of extended family. Protected from the details of her mother's death during her early years, she became a living testament to survival. Family members spoke of their commitment to preserving Carlin's memory, sharing stories of her laughter, her dedication to service, and the love she poured into the short months of motherhood she was granted. Photos of Carlin in uniform, smiling with her baby in her arms, became both comfort and reminder of what had been taken. The case of PFC Carlin Ramirez remains etched in the annals of military and criminal justice as an example of how personal obsession can weaponize discipline and training. Investigators often reflected on the painstaking work required to unravel a crime committed with such precision. Every toll record, every surveillance image, every deleted text message represented countless hours of coordination across states and agencies. Their success demonstrated the power of persistence in the face of a suspect who believed he could outmaneuver the system. Years after the verdict, the townhouse in Severn returned to quiet normalcy, but the story it once held lingers in the memories of those who investigated, prosecuted, and mourned. Neighbors still recall the shock of that summer morning when police cars and crime scene tape shattered their sense of suburban safety. Soldiers at Fort Meade remember the briefings that followed, warning of the hidden dangers of domestic violence. Advocates cite Carlin's name in workshops and policy discussions, ensuring that her death continues to drive reforms intended to protect others in uniform. The murder of Carlin Ramirez exposed a collision of personal violence and military life, revealing how control, jealousy, and fear can lead to irreversible tragedy. Her determination to create a safe future for her child was met with a lethal act. On a freezing New Year's Eve in Michigan, a decorated young soldier stepped into his family driveway and never returned. Behind the sudden gunfire lay a secret affair, a cross-state conspiracy, and a chilling betrayal that turned love into lethal ambition. This is the calculated murder of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III. The final hours of 2018 settled over St. Joseph Township, Michigan, with the kind of crisp winter quiet that carries every sound. Houses along Colfax Avenue were strung with fading holiday lights, their reflections glittering on patches of icy pavement. Inside one modest home, the Hassel family gathered in celebration. 23-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III had returned from Fort Stewart, Georgia, on holiday leave, bringing his wife, Specialist Kimia Hassel, and their infant son to spend New Year's Eve with his father. Tyrone's arrival was more than a family reunion. It was a moment of pride. A disciplined young soldier who had served overseas, he embodied the dedication and steadiness that his relatives admired. Photographs taken that evening show him smiling easily, a proud father holding his baby, unaware of the danger that waited outside. As midnight approached, Tyrone offered to carry leftovers and gifts to the family car. The night air was sharp, the streets still. He stepped into the driveway balancing containers of food, his breath a faint cloud in the cold. A sudden burst of gunfire tore through the silence. Neighbors later described hearing a rapid series of shots, a sound so abrupt that some thought fireworks had begun early. Tyrone collapsed on the pavement, struck repeatedly. Inside the house, startled relatives rushed to the door. Kimia's voice pierced the night as she called 911, pleading for help while her husband lay bleeding. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the wounds were catastrophic. Tyrone was pronounced dead before doctors could attempt surgery. The killing stunned the quiet Michigan community. Initial speculation focused on a possible robbery or random act of violence. Yet detectives quickly noticed details that challenged those theories. Tyrone's wallet and phone remained untouched. Nothing was taken from the vehicle or the driveway. Whoever fired the shots had acted with precision and then disappeared into the winter darkness. St. Joseph Township Police, accustomed to property crimes and occasional domestic disputes, suddenly faced a calculated homicide. Detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing the victim's final hours. They interviewed family members, friends, and fellow soldiers, looking for anything that might reveal a motive. Tyrone's father described a son devoted to both duty and family, a young man who balanced military discipline with warmth and humor. Neighbors spoke of a cheerful visitor who seemed to have no enemies. Yet as investigators widened their circle, they learned that Tyrone's marriage, while outwardly stable, carried undercurrents of tension. Kimia Hassel had met Tyrone during their military service. To those who saw their social media posts, the couple appeared enviably happy. Two soldiers building a future together, raising a baby, and navigating the challenges of Army life. Behind that image, however, were arguments about time apart, the strains of deployment, and the complexities of young parenthood. Relatives recalled occasional disagreements, but nothing that suggested violence. Still, the police could not ignore the possibility that someone close to the family might hold the key to the mystery. As detectives examined Tyrone's digital footprint, they found no evidence of threats or disputes that might lead to a targeted attack. His banking records were normal, his military record clean. The absence of a clear motive deepened the puzzle. Attention turned to Kimia, the last person to see him alive. Her statements to investigators were consistent and calm, describing a sudden eruption of gunfire and a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure. She expressed grief but maintained composure, a demeanor some officers found striking given the brutality of the crime. The investigation moved into the realm of forensic science. Ballistic experts analyzed shell casings recovered from the driveway, concluding that the shooter used a handgun fired at close range. Surveillance cameras in the neighborhood yielded grainy images of a dark vehicle circling the area before the attack. Tire impressions matched those of a mid-sized sedan but provided no license plate or definitive lead. With winter temperatures hampering the collection of trace evidence, the case seemed poised to stall. Then came a breakthrough from the digital realm. Cell phone records, obtained through warrants, revealed unusual patterns of communication in the hours surrounding the murder. Investigators noticed that Kimia's phone had exchanged frequent messages with an out-of-state number linked to Fort Stewart, where both she and Tyrone were stationed. The timing of those messages, some sent just before the shooting, raised immediate suspicion. Further analysis traced the number to specialist Jeremy Cuellar, a fellow soldier and acquaintance of the couple. Detectives dug into Cuellar's background and discovered a complex web of connections. He and Kimia had trained together and maintained regular contact despite being assigned to different units. Their interactions, initially dismissed as friendly exchanges between colleagues, took on new significance when digital forensics uncovered deleted Snapchat messages and hidden conversations. Among the recovered fragments were hints of an intimate relationship and discussions that, while cryptic, suggested planning beyond casual chat. The emerging picture unsettled investigators. If Kimia and Cuellar were more than friends, could jealousy or desire have fueled a deadly plot? Surveillance and travel records soon revealed that Cuellar had taken leave from Fort Stewart around the time of the murder. Toll receipts and fuel purchases placed his vehicle on a route from Georgia to Michigan in the days leading up to New Year's Eve. The distance, nearly 900 miles, indicated deliberate intent rather than coincidence. As these revelations surfaced, detectives maintained tight control of information, wary of tipping off potential suspects. They re-interviewed Kimia, probing for inconsistencies. She repeated her account without visible anxiety, denying any improper relationship with Cuellar and insisting she knew nothing about his travels. Yet her phone told a different story. Location data showed that she and Cuellar had exchanged messages about meeting in the days before the shooting, including conversations that stopped abruptly on the night of Tyrone's death. The combination of ballistic evidence, travel logs, and digital communication began to form a narrative of calculated betrayal. It appeared that Jeremy Cuellar had driven across multiple states to execute a carefully timed ambush. The question now confronting investigators was the extent of Kimia's involvement. Was she an unwitting participant or the architect of the plan? Detectives believed the latter, but to prove it they needed irrefutable evidence linking her to the murder's preparation. In the weeks following the shooting, surveillance teams monitored both Cuellar and Kimia as they returned to military duties in Georgia. Undercover officers tracked their movements, collected additional digital records, and sought cooperation from military authorities. The picture that emerged was chilling. Recovered messages detailed not only expressions of affection but also explicit discussions of logistics, travel dates, weapon acquisition, and opportunities to catch Tyrone alone. Each new discovery tightened the net around the two soldiers, transforming the case from a baffling local homicide into a cross-state conspiracy. By mid-January, law enforcement officials were convinced they had uncovered the truth behind the New Year's Eve murder. What had first appeared to be a random attack now looked like the final act of a meticulously planned scheme. As arrests loomed, the community that had mourned a fallen soldier braced for revelations that would expose not only a killer, but also the cold calculus of those closest to him. The arrests came quietly but decisively, the product of weeks of coordination between Michigan detectives and military investigators at Fort Stewart. Jeremy Cuellar was taken into custody first, confronted with the digital trail that charted his journey from Georgia to Michigan and back. He initially denied any involvement, insisting that his leave was coincidental and his relationship with Kimia purely platonic. Yet the evidence arrayed against him was formidable. Cell tower pings traced his movements with uncanny precision, placing his phone near the Hassel family home at the exact time of the shooting. Toll booth cameras captured his vehicle heading north days before the murder and returning south shortly after. Surveillance footage from a Michigan gas station even caught a fleeting image of Cuellar alone, refueling late at night. The pattern of travel and the timing of each stop left little room for innocent explanation. Investigators applied steady pressure, presenting their findings during long hours of interrogation. Forensic analysis of Cuellar's phone uncovered deleted Snapchat messages that, once restored, revealed conversations with Kimia filled with coded language and veiled references to getting it done and making a move. The more detectives showed him, the more his resolve weakened. After days of questioning, Cuellar finally broke. In a quiet interview room, he admitted to driving nearly 900 miles to kill Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III. His confession opened the floodgates, providing the chilling details of a plan born not from sudden rage but from months of clandestine communication and cold calculation. According to Cuellar's statement, the affair with Kimia had intensified during shared deployments and long hours away from spouses and families. They found in each other a dangerous mix of excitement and escape. What began as flirtation evolved into late-night meetings, secret exchanges, and eventually conversations about a future together. Tyrone's presence was an obstacle to that imagined life. Cuellar described discussions in which Kimia lamented her marriage and speculated about benefits she might receive if Tyrone were gone, including military death gratuities and life insurance payouts. Over time, those conversations hardened into a plan. Kimia allegedly proposed the idea outright, assuring Cuellar that her husband's routines during holiday leave would create the perfect opportunity. Cuellar recounted how he left Fort Stewart under the pretense of visiting family, carrying a handgun obtained through contacts in Georgia. He drove for 2 days, sleeping in his car, and arrived in Michigan on December 30th. He scouted the Hassel residence, noting the driveway, the lighting, and potential escape routes. On New Year's Eve, he parked nearby and waited in the freezing dark. When Tyrone emerged carrying food containers, Cuellar stepped from the shadows and opened fire, striking his target multiple times before fleeing into the night. He returned to his vehicle and began the long drive south, discarding shell casings and cleaning the gun along the way. His account matched ballistic evidence and surveillance records, leaving little doubt about his role as the triggerman. While Cuellar's confession provided a crucial breakthrough, investigators still needed to establish Kimia's complicity beyond the ambiguous messages. They examined her financial records, looking for signs of impending payouts or unusual transactions. They scrutinized her behavior immediately after the shooting, noting her calm demeanor during interviews and her ability to maintain military duties despite the violent loss of her husband. Friends and fellow soldiers described her as composed to the point of detachment, a quality prosecutors would later argue reflected calculation rather than grief. The recovered digital exchanges proved damning. Forensic technicians reconstructed deleted Snapchat and text messages showing Kimia encouraging Cuellar and discussing travel logistics. One message outlined the best times to find Tyrone outside alone. Another advised on when she would be with family to provide an alibi. Investigators also discovered that Kimia had researched life insurance benefits and death gratuities in the weeks leading up to the murder. These findings transformed suspicion into certainty. Armed with Cuellar's confession and the digital evidence, prosecutors prepared charges of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder against both suspects. The case drew intense media attention, its mix of military discipline and intimate betrayal capturing public fascination. Reporters crowded the Berrien County Courthouse as pretrial hearings began, eager for details about the young soldier whose life had been cut short by those he trusted most. During early proceedings, prosecutors outlined a narrative of calculated greed and passion. They argued that Kimia Hassel, frustrated by marital responsibilities and enticed by the promise of financial gain, orchestrated her husband's murder to free herself for a future with Cuellar. They presented travel records, phone logs, and Cuellar's confession as evidence of a conspiracy carefully executed across state lines. The defense sought to undermine Cuellar's credibility, suggesting that he acted alone out of obsessive desire and was now implicating Kimia to lessen his own punishment. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Family members of Tyrone Hassel sat through graphic testimony describing the ambush and the cold precision of the attack. Military colleagues, some in uniform, filled the benches, their presence a silent tribute to the fallen sergeant. Witnesses recounted the couple's outwardly loving relationship and the shock of discovering the hidden affair. Prosecutors displayed enlarged text messages and call logs, methodically walking jurors through the timeline of planning and execution. Each exhibit reinforced the image of a murder that was anything but spontaneous. Cuellar, having accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony, became the state's star witness. On the stand, he spoke in measured tones, describing not only the night of the killing but also the months of secret planning. He admitted his love for Kimia and acknowledged that he fired the shots that ended Tyrone's life. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys challenged his motives, accusing him of manipulating Kimia and exaggerating her role to save himself. Cuellar maintained that the plot was mutual, insisting that Kimia's encouragement was essential to his decision to act. As the trial unfolded, the human dimensions of the crime emerged in painful clarity. Tyrone's father testified about receiving the late-night call and rushing to the driveway where his son lay dying. Friends described Tyrone as a disciplined soldier and devoted father whose generosity masked the private strains of military life. For the jury, these accounts underscored the depth of the loss and the brutality of the betrayal. Kimia Hassel remained composed throughout the proceedings, her face an unreadable mask as former lover and former allies detailed the plot. When her attorneys argued that she was a naive young woman swept up in Cuellar's obsession, prosecutors countered with messages in which she urged him to be careful and coordinated his arrival in Michigan. The evidence painted a portrait of a woman who balanced military duties and motherhood while secretly engineering her husband's death. By the time closing arguments arrived, the narrative was clear. The prosecution framed the murder as the intersection of desire and calculation, a crime that required not just passion but planning. They reminded jurors of the meticulous travel logs, the deleted messages, and the cold efficiency of the ambush. The defense urged the jury to consider the possibility of manipulation, pointing to Cuellar's admitted obsession and his incentive to shift blame. But the weight of digital forensics and eyewitness testimony hung heavily over the courtroom. As deliberations began, the community awaited a verdict that would decide whether Kimia Hassel, the grieving widow who had stood at her husband's funeral, would now be judged a conspirator in his murder. The question of intent, whether she merely entertained dark fantasies or actively plotted Tyrone's death, lay at the heart of the jury's task. Outside the courthouse, reporters speculated about possible sentences, while inside, the silence of the deliberation room carried the gravity of lives forever altered by a single night of gunfire. The jury's deliberation lasted less than a full day, a testament to the clarity of the evidence and the strength of the prosecution's case. When the panel returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Family members clutched each other's hands, soldiers in uniform stood silently at the back, and reporters readied their pens. The foreperson rose and delivered the verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Kimia Hassel showed no outward reaction, her face a mask as the words echoed through the packed chamber. Moments later, the judge pronounced the mandatory sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The quiet in the room broke into muffled sobs and whispers, a mixture of grief, relief, and disbelief. Jeremy Cuellar had already sealed his fate. Having confessed and cooperated with prosecutors, he accepted a plea deal that spared him the uncertainty of a trial but guaranteed a lengthy sentence. He too received life in prison for his role in the killing. For investigators and prosecutors, the dual convictions represented justice for a young soldier who had served his country only to be betrayed by those closest to him. For Tyrone's family, the verdicts were both a victory and a permanent reminder of loss. In the weeks that followed, the case continued to reverberate far beyond the courthouse. Local residents struggled to reconcile the brutal crime with the quiet suburban neighborhood where it unfolded. Neighbors who had once waved to the young couple now spoke of sleepless nights and lingering unease. Military communities at Fort Stewart and across the Army examined the story with equal shock. Soldiers who had trained and deployed with all three individuals found themselves questioning how the bonds of service and camaraderie could conceal such lethal deception. At Kimia's sentencing hearing, members of Tyrone's family addressed the court, their voices breaking as they described the void left by his death. His father recounted the pride he felt watching his son rise through the military ranks and the horror of finding him dying in the driveway. He spoke of the grandson who would grow up without a father and the bitter realization that the child's mother was responsible for the tragedy. Other relatives remembered Tyrone as a man of quiet strength, someone who balanced discipline with a gentle sense of humor. Each statement underscored the profound human cost of the crime, a cost that extended beyond the prison walls that would now confine both perpetrators. For prosecutors, the case stood as a textbook example of how digital evidence can expose hidden motives. Cell tower data, snapshot recoveries, and location tracking formed a web of proof that neither defendant could escape. Detectives later reflected on the investigation's turning points, from the first suspicious phone records to the painstaking reconstruction of deleted messages. They described a sense of inevitability once the data aligned, a realization that technology had preserved a record of betrayal even as the conspirators believed their secrets would vanish. Military officials at Fort Stewart also conducted internal reviews, considering the challenges faced by young soldiers balancing deployments, marriages, and the isolation of base life. While no policy changes could have prevented the crime, the case sparked conversations about mental health resources, relationship counseling, and the pressures that can fester in the tight-knit environment of a military installation. Chaplains and counselors reported an increase in service members seeking guidance, a quiet ripple effect of a tragedy that began with a clandestine affair and ended in calculated violence. Media coverage of the trial and sentencing introduced the public to the stark contrasts of the case. Photographs of Tyrone in uniform, smiling with his infant son, standing proudly with his unit, appeared alongside images of Kimia in court, her expression unreadable as jurors weighed her fate. Commentators noted the chilling dissonance between the disciplined world of the U.S. Army and the reckless, selfish motives that drove the murder. True crime programs later chronicled the events in documentaries and podcasts, dissecting each twist of the investigation and each detail of the lovers' secret communications. Inside prison walls, both Kimia and Cuellar began serving their life sentences. Cuellar, whose cooperation spared him the death penalty, faced the reality of decades behind bars for a crime he once justified as an act of love. Kimia, stripped of rank and uniform, confronted the isolation of a life sentence. Though she maintained a subdued demeanor in public statements, letters released through her attorney hinted at a slow reckoning with the enormity of her actions. Neither expressed remorse that satisfied Tyrone's family, who viewed every official statement as inadequate compared to the irreversible loss of a son, a father, and a soldier. For Tyrone's young son, the consequences were particularly cruel. He would grow up without the father who had cradled him in holiday photographs and without the mother who plotted the killing. Relatives stepped in to provide care and stability, vowing to preserve Tyrone's memory and protect the child from the shadow of the crime. Family members described the boy's resemblance to his father as both a comfort and a source of enduring sadness, a daily reminder of the life stolen on a cold New Year's Eve. Community memorials kept Tyrone's legacy alive. Annual vigils in St. Joseph Township drew fellow soldiers, friends, and neighbors who gathered to honor his service and condemn the betrayal that ended his life. Speakers emphasized the qualities that defined him: discipline, kindness, loyalty, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the deceit that led to his death. Military comrades shared stories of overseas missions and quiet acts of leadership, painting a portrait of a young man whose dedication to duty never wavered. The case of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III endures as more than a headline. It is a cautionary tale about the destructive power of hidden desires and the deceptive calm that can mask lethal intentions. It reveals how digital footprints can illuminate the darkest corners of human behavior, and how even tightly regulated institutions like the military are not immune to the chaos of personal betrayal. Above all, it stands as a tragedy measured not only in the loss of a promising life but also in the shattering of a family, a community, and the ideals of trust that bind people together. As years pass, the driveway where Tyrone fell remains an ordinary stretch of pavement in a quiet Michigan neighborhood. Children ride bicycles past the spot, neighbors mow their lawns, and winter snow covers the scars of that violent night. Yet for those who knew him, the memory of gunfire on New Year's Eve never fades.